The year 1996 was a really weird one for comic book. The year 1996 was a really weird one for the comic book industry. There were comic book shops closing left and right, largely due to the speculator boom of the early 90s turning into a big old bust. If you guys might remember, if you're old like me, the Death of Superman stuff, the X-Men comics of the early 90s, everybody thought that shit was gonna be worth a ton of money, and so they were buying up those comics left and right, and then when they realized they were just gonna be worth nothing because they had printed up so many of those, people just sort of lost interest in comic books. Also in 1996, we had Marvel's Heroes Reborn series, where a bunch of the Image creators that had left Marvel back in the early 90s came back to do some work for them on Fantastic Four and the Avengers. We had this Rob Liefeld Captain America drawing, which to this day, people still talk about because it's obviously pretty ridiculous. But for wrestling fans, we had the Ultimate Warrior comic book drop in May of 1996. Now, this is a good 5 years or so after the Ultimate Warrior's peak of popularity when he beat Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania for the WWF title. But shortly after that, like, the bloom really started to come off the rose. And by 1996, Ultimate Warrior, even though he had been brought back a couple times by the WWF, including that year in 1996, he really did not have the popularity that he had once before. He sort of turned out to be a bit of a flash in the pan. Enter the Ultimate Warrior comic book. Now, this is not the first time the Warrior had been in a comic book. Back during the peak of his popularity, WWF had put out this Ultimate Warrior comic book called Ultimate Warrior's Workout. The most notable thing about this for me is that it's drawn by one of my favorite cartoonists of all time, Dave Lapham, who of course did Stray Bullets. I actually did a review of this on the channel. I'll link that video in the description. In any event, I thought it would be fun today to take a look at the 1996 Ultimate Warrior comic book. I ordered this off eBay. The floral packaging here is not part of the Ultimate Warrior's comic book. So I'm gonna open this thing up and we're gonna take a look at the Ultimate Warrior comic book today. I'm going into this with an open mind. I know that this has been reviewed by a great many YouTube videos out there. I know that because I did some research first. And I know that this thing is widely considered to be pretty batshit crazy. So here you go. This is the Warrior comic book number 1. I'm about to set up my phone camera over here, but I'm just gonna show you guys the cover. You guys have probably all seen it. I will say this, it is a powerful cover. This right here, Warrior's screaming face, looks like he has a couple fillings in his teeth as well. He's sweating profusely. Yeah, we're gonna take a look at it page by page. This is from Ultimate Creations Presents Warrior number 1. So there, we're gonna take a look at this. Shout out to cartoonist Kayfabe for the whole like comic book camera pointing down at it while my hands, which by the way, this is gnarly. My cat has scratched the crap out of me here. And so forgive the scratches all over my hands. We play pretty rough, that cat and I. Anyways, here's the Warrior comic. Now I know, look, dude, I know this is WrestleJuice, right? And like my whole thing is to take the piss out of stuff. I'm not really gonna do that too much here because this is a comic book. This is something that people worked on. And yes, I know Warrior was kind of a weird guy. And let's be completely honest, in many cases publicly, he was kind of an awful guy, specifically, of course, when he would go on his homophobic rants. Awful, awful stuff. I'd like to think that his wife is telling the truth when she says that later on he reformed and he became a much more compassionate person before he passed. So I'm not here to judge the guy. I've made fun of the Warrior quite a bit across the Going In Raw channel and the WrestleJuice stuff, but other people worked on it. I did go through this first just to sort of get a grasp on what it was. Comic books can be a great variety of things. They can be good, they can be bad, they could be weird, or they can be boring. This is definitely not boring. It is on the weird side, and I'll be honest with you, weird comics are kind of my thing. I love when they are weird. The weirder the better. My comics, I'll be honest with you, a little bit on the weird side. You can buy them right now at mfshophere.com. I'd like to take a look at this comic through the lens of not the Ultimate Warrior, even though it is exclusively about the Ultimate Warrior and what's going on inside his head. But there were other people that worked on this comic as well. The thing that stands out to me immediately when I see the cover is the energy. And that actually applies to the interior artwork as well. The energy that Jim Callahan brings to this comic is very palpable. It comes through on the page, and the colors as well, who I forget, J.D. Smith did the colors on this thing, and it pops. It actually makes really good use of computerized colors, which around the early 90s to mid 90s, specifically the early 90s, I think Spawn was one of the first books to really go all in on really nice looking computerized colors, as opposed to the way comic books traditionally did them, which still, I'll be honest, kind of confuses me. But this right here is actually, it's a really well-made comic book from a production standpoint, from an artistic standpoint. This would not be out of place amongst a lot of the Image books. In fact, Rob Liefeld, who I mentioned in the intro, his entire studio, Extreme Studios, were basically a bunch of dudes that drew like Rob Liefeld. It was the style to ape back in the day. And obviously, if you know anything about comics, you would know that this style right here is very much in line with that. However, I will say this, a lot of the times when you get these sort of Rob Liefeld ripoff comics, they would be really sparse on the background details. It was like they were just sort of churning them out. And in this case, the world building is all there. I'm never confused as to where I am. I am 1000% confused as to what is being said, because the Warrior was just sort of flooding us with his seemingly stream of consciousness stuff. It starts off here. The very first page introduces the concept of distrucity, which is a very Warrior thing. And it's got like 3 different meanings. As you can see in this, it says, the name of the galaxy in Warrior wherein the terrain of Testament lies. So that's like, I guess, a physical galaxy within the lore of the Warrior comic. That's easy enough to understand. Number 2, the living of one's life in the way of a warrior according to the Warrior's 8 disciplines. So now we're getting into the philosophy of what, I guess, Jim Hellwig, who had legally changed his name to Warrior back then, was into. The physical discipline, beliefs, moment of mastery, attitude, commitment, association, integrity, and wisdom. That's kind of all over the map there. And then he says, distrucity is the creating of a truce between one's destiny and one's reality, promising to stay true to what one is destined to be, yet accepting what is the now, one's reality. It goes into a lot of detail right here. Far more detail than I think is probably necessary, but I will say this. In terms of a person wanting to, I don't know, espouse his own beliefs in oneself, he definitely achieves that here. I mean, he's definitely giving everybody exactly what he's thinking about, and he doesn't really edit himself. The actual story itself of like the Warrior in this comic basically borrows heavily from the most generic of myth, you know? Like, a guy is sort of born of the cosmos, it's the Warrior. He goes through whatever this hellish scape is here with all these little demon guys, lands on some sort of planet in the galaxy seemingly of distrucity, finds himself in the fetal position in a crater, and then he sleeps for a bunch of seasons. Very sort of biblical, myth-like, godlike, whatever. Wakes up, he's clearly on some sort of other planet, and then he finds himself in a variety of environments, snow, tropical, whatever the canyons are here. He runs a lot, and then he encounters at the bed of this lake here his apparently his father right here, this guy who shows up kind of in hologram form, and he talks to him a little bit. We have like some training montage. This seems to be commingled with like his human side, and I think that's where the comic ends up going. I do not have issues 2 through 4, but we've got, you know, some like real human life stuff going on here. a little example of Warrior in his actual sort of warrior ring attire, I guess. And then the father disappears and there's some blood left over. And then the Warrior takes that blood and then he dives into the water. And that's sort of where he is reborn, because he comes shooting back out and he becomes, and then he fights a bunch of dudes. And then we'll get to the fighting here in a second. But it is quite the verbose book. And there's a couple things that I'm kind of don't understand. There's like some panels here, some word panels here, or some word balloons, I guess, that are like one voice, and then this one is another voice, and maybe it's the dichotomy of like the Warrior and like Jim Hellwig, I guess. I don't know. But none of it really makes a lot of sense, which I'll be honest with you, I'm totally fine with, because I'd rather have a bunch of like wackadoo prose than... So when I was a kid, when I was like 12, 13, whatever, the first issue of Youngblood came out. It was, I think, the first Image release, if I'm not mistaken, Rob Liefeld's Youngblood, right? I tried reading this thing. It is the most generic spy action adventure, just every trope that Liefeld had worked on at Marvel ended up in this Youngblood book. Made him a ton of money. And it was so much fun to look at. The energy was all there in the book, much like here in this Warrior comic. There was so much life to the artwork, and that's what drove that stuff. This is similar, except the dialogue, if you can call it that, the inner monologue, I guess, because there's not actually a lot of dialogue. The inner monologue stuff is just sort of Warrior's unfiltered thoughts. And it is on the crazy side, but at least you can tell that there's intention there. I kind of don't think that Warrior was really doing this to make a lot of money, although he did try to convince Vince McMahon to order like 1 million copies of these. It didn't sell terribly well, but because I think I read that it landed at like about 150. It was like the 150th largest selling comic in May of 1996 or whatever. It was something along those lines. But it just honestly feels like Warrior was taking to the comic books to get his philosophies out there, which is kind of, I don't know, there is some pure intention there. He's not just coming up with some bullshit to sell people on or to try to have made into a movie or a cartoon or something. Like this right here is actually stuff that he seemingly believes. In any event, it continues on. He gets out of this, and we have like a protracted fight scene where all these like ghouls, and this is what he says here. All a warrior battles remains faceless until he has conquered it into an identity. So you've got these little warrior demons here. And he's fighting all these guys, and it's a standard fight scene. And the funny thing is, like, the inner monologue stuff is all like this, crazy warrior verbose stuff, right? But then when the actual warrior guy talks, he says crazy shit like, "In your face, freak, feel my power bring you face to face with being no more." Which is like, I'm sorry, what'd you say? So anyways, he ends up beating all these guys. They leaving a big crater right here. And there's still some dead ones on the ground that he had left. And so they've got like some lizard skin going on here. And so he like opens them up, and I think he takes out the heart. And because of that, he becomes the ultimate warrior right here. So that's his creation myth. That's his creation story. That's how the warrior was born. Full blown, it says right here. And then at the same time, we have something going on seemingly here on Earth in the real world, because we are in a hospital. And maybe this is Jim Hellwig, I don't know. But he's laying here in the hospital bed. And maybe this is Dana Warrior, I don't know. At this point, he was actually Warrior. He had legally changed his name. And she's here, and she says, "I don't want to imagine my life without you." And then there's this nefarious looking fella right here who is seemingly holding this image of him in the hospital, or this reality or whatever. Maybe it's like a little Globe TV, I don't know. Streaming service, hospital room cam, I guess. And he says, "Believe this," as in, I guess you're going to have to believe your life without him, because whoever this fella is who I'm assuming we see more of in issue 2, is going to go up. So it leaves on a cliffhanger, which is pretty cool. Standard comic book trope. Leaves you wanting more, I guess. We had the whole creation story here already. So I'm wondering, like, is this going to be his alter ego here on Earth? And then he's going to battle whoever this guy is right here? I don't know. He's got a very Minecrafty looking head right there. But again, I will say, the artwork from Jim Callahan and the colors from, what's his name? J.D. Smith. It's a good looking comic book. Like, this is, and like I said, if I had no idea who the Ultimate Warrior was, if this dude just came out of nowhere and dropped this comic book, I might actually get number 2. I might be sitting here thinking, this is some absolutely insane stuff. That usually is the recipe for a good comic book. The crazier, the better. And so, yeah, I'll be honest with you guys. I kind of fuck with it. There's a lot more right here. Again, the Warrior had a lot on his mind. The meaning of the story I wish to tell upon the pages of Warrior can be captured in one word: belief. It says, some 24 years ago, around the age of 12, belief became the most important factor in my life. My first encounter with the powers of belief, a consciousness of belief, happened through the power of fantasy, a make-believe friend. He says, at the time, my friend didn't have a name. He didn't really need one. He was a close your eyes and I'll be there friend. Nobody needed to know about him, and I really didn't care much about introducing him to anyone else. His sudden presence coincided with my undying curiosity about the what's, where's, why's, and how's of the world and my life. So maybe this is kind of a story about that. I don't know. There's a lot going on here. And he concludes it by saying, the responsibility I have in being him is to tell the story of how you too have an intuition. So he wants to teach you guys how to be a warrior. Which, again, and I'm not sure what is going on here. Oh, we got a Warrior University appearance here. We have, he even gave a whole page for Jim Callahan to talk as well. And he points out there's a lot of thank yous here to some names that I recognize from the comic book industry. But it is kind of interesting because this first paragraph here is kind of indicative of what the comic book industry is going through at the time. He says, I've been a comics pro now for 6 years. During that time, a lot has changed. The economy, comics, and the people who make them all drastically changed. Creators walk around with big heads, talking down to fans and charging outlandish rates for store appearances. Companies jerk around writers and artists without any thought at all, not to mention the hundreds who were fired this past holiday season with no warning at all. And what about the retailers? What's going to happen to them? Whatever happened to comics that were just plain fun? What about the fans? So, I mean, if nothing else, I'm not going to clown on it because it's interesting. It's not boring. And what more do you want from a comic book? I mean, a coherent story would be great. Just like they say with movies, every comic book that's actually get made, it's a bit of a miracle. Warrior did this interview at Comic-Con 1996. You can see it on YouTube. And he says how this comic took 8 months to be developed. And that's a lot of time. That's a lot of thought. That's a lot of energy put into a project like this. That's my review of the Warrior comic book. Should I get number 2? You guys let me know in the comments. Let me know what you guys thought about the Warrior comic. Till next time, we'll see you guys around. Comic book. Okay. The year 1990.